Hello and welcome to the Apiary. This is Jake B-Man with Golden Fox Farms. Today we're actually going to do one of my classroom presentations, my presentation on winter prep. This is a presentation I take to local bee clubs and regional bee groups to help them improve their winter survival. It is ultimately written for an audience in my region, which is the greater Louisville, Kentucky area, but a lot of the lessons in there are applicable to whatever you have where you are. The big thing to figure out winter survival is actually to find someone else who's been good at it in your area and taking their recommendations and their practices and implementing them in your own bee yard. For me, winter prep starts as soon as supers come off the hive. Months ago, back early August, late July, because I'm already having to ask myself, how am I going to drag all these bees through winter? This presentation gets into that. All right, this is my classroom presentation on a winter prep. This is about understanding key variables in survival for your bee colonies going through winter. This is Jake Barker, also known as Jake B. Man. I am a EAS and Cornell Master Beekeeper. I run about 125 hives for honey, queens, and nukes, and all sorts of other odds and ends in the greater Louisville, Kentucky area. I am a non-migratory beekeeper. My colonies stay in the same spots all year. That's as opposed to guys who ship them down south for easier wintering or into potato barns to winter them in warmer conditions in colder climates. So that means I need to get my bees keyed in to survive winter before winter gets here. Now, before we get into the big variables in winter prep, we're going to go through this little introduction, and that is understand managing for winter survival is the hardest skill in beekeeping. It is not adequately addressed in our beekeeping guide books. You only get one shot per year to do it right, and there is little room for error. And when there is an error, it usually is a big one in terms of losses. There's lots of different equipment options, approaches, and concerns. This is somewhat driven by where you are at in the world. You can spend a small fortune on beekeeping equipment, especially when it comes to winter prep stuff between quilt boxes and commercial wraps and everything else. Part of the problem with all of this is research on wintering is actually pretty scant. If you go to Google Scholar and search Varroa, you'll get hundreds of articles back. If you try to find an article that specifically looks at winter management, it is hard to find. Like, I have looked far and wide for an article just on quilt boxes. Do quilt boxes improve survival? And best I can tell, that article, that research is non-existent. And another layer to this is terroir, terrier. That's the French word for sense of place. Every location is going to have its own wintering challenges. Even minor climatic differences within 100 miles can greatly change what you need to do to winter your colonies, which is why it's so imperative to get good advice from successful local beekeepers to figure out the best approaches for your region. And we'll dive into a couple of different regional examples. What are the key variables in survival? The reality is keeping a dry hive with enough feed and healthy bees in it. So these six little things are all parts of that. You know, is the hive arranged as a double? Is it arranged as a single? Is it arranged to be vented, or is it kind of insulated and closed off? The bee subspecies. Are you using Italians that burn through stores or Carniolians that are a bit cheaper on stores? That's going to influence what your actual needs are. Are there enough bees? They need a certain number of bees to actually cluster and survive cold temperatures. Do they have enough bees in there that are healthy? Do they have enough food? Bees burn through stores in wintertime. That's why they store honey in the first place. Do they have enough of it? And are the pests controlled? Do they have a mite issue? Is the queen good? Is the queen laying enough eggs in there to have a good winter population before winter gets here? Now, a question you should keep in mind before we even get into wintering is, what do you need coming out of winter? What is your limiting factor? Is it space and equipment? Is it time and cash? If so, you should probably be more conservative on the colonies you attempt to winter. Wintering fewer, stronger colonies is cheaper and more efficient, and is a fine approach to take. Myself, I'm usually scratching for queens come springtime. I have colonies that need split and I run out of queens. So queens are what I consider my limiting factor. That means I'll take in the winter any colony I think has enough chutzpah to make it because I want as many queens as possible in the spring. Now, there's a dichotomy of how hives are set up for wintering. There's insulating hives where you put the foam boxes on them and reduce air exchange, and there's wide open throttle where they have open airflow and limited insulation. The, the wide open throttle hives have higher bee losses and will have more food consumed to keep the temperatures up in that colony. That also means more wear and tear on the bees. They do benefit from solar gain rather, because as the exterior of the hive is heated, the bees inside can take advantage of that. This as opposed to insulating the hives where they don't get the solar gain, but they have a warmer temperature altogether. It does lower the amount of bees you lose over the cluster size over winter. They keep more bees alive, and food consumption is reduced, and there's less wear and tear on the bees. The big drawback to insulating a hive is, in fact, the effort and equipment to insulate the hive. So let's go into a couple of specific examples, comparing extreme examples. Michael Palmer at 10 and Jamie Ellis at kind of three different extremes of our region, or country rather. Mike Palmer's up in Vermont, roughly at the Canada and New York state lines, up there on the northeast side of Lake Champlain. And he is a fan of the wide open throttle model. The way he winters hives is he feeds them up to like 180 pounds, wraps them in tar paper, puts a foam board between the inner and outer covers, and has top and bottom entrances. What that means is his bees readily consume honey and generate heat, and the byproducts of that respiration, the CO2, the moisture, the heat, are allowed to discharge through the top opening of the hive. Top openings are important for him because he has a lot of snow where he is, and he's got a lot of hives, so he can't get out there and clear off entrances. If he was wholly reliant on bottom entrances, a lot of his bees would be stuck inside and would just die from not being able to make cleansing flights, matter of factly. The other perk of the tar paper wrap that Mike does is a lot of his hives have little holes or cracks or anything else. That blocks them off. It gives them windbreaks, so to speak. Mike is very successful with the wide open throttle approach, and it requires less equipment. The other version of this is a tan tardif. He is up in the Yukon. Roughly, if you went from Anchorage to the state line of Alaska and continue that same distance into Yukon, that's where he is. He insulates his hives very extensively, using a bunch of thick styrofoam to make an insulated box, in addition to a quilt box on top. This reduces the amount of air changes to the outside world and greatly reduces the amount of honey his bees need to survive in his very northern location. Historically, if you want to keep bees in that part of the world, you would just buy in packages in the spring and kill them in the fall. He's able to take hives through winter with this setup. It's quite fascinating. And the other extreme is Jamie Ellis. Jamie Ellis has never kept bees where it gets cold. Jamie is in Florida at University of Florida today, the state land-grant college down there. And for them, the winter, they just have a super on the hive, because winter in Florida really just means a month-long dearth. That dearth can be extended by weather events like the hurricane taking out certain blooms, which has happened in recent years, but they have a decidedly different version of wintering than a great deal of the United States does. Now, we can also look at different hive arrangements in terms of double deeps versus singles versus triples versus nuke towers versus styrofoam nukes. This was done by Megan Milbrath before she was a professor at Michigan State. She was in Munith, that's roughly due west of Detroit, and she ran a bunch of colonies in parallel to see how the survival would shake out. And, there's some variability in what she found. She found the styrofoam hives and single deeps had better survival. But I'm willing to bet if we repeated this study over and over and over again, we'd probably see all of these numbers ballpark around 75% survival. And the reason why I'm sharing this is I really think the specific hive arrangement isn't too important for most of us. Most of these hives can be taken through winter successfully. It's control of the other three variables that are important: dry hive, enough food, enough bees. And for comparison purposes, let's look at a USDA hardiness zone map. I am the location in Louisville, Kentucky. I'm in 6B. It gets down to -5 degrees here. Compare that to some of our other examples where there's Jamie Ellis in Florida. It's much warmer down there. Megan Milbrath in Michigan, Mike Palmer in Vermont, Etienne in the Yukon relative to Alaska. But next month or this month, I'm teaching a class on this subject in Omaha. And even though Omaha and myself are in very similar latitudes, they are just a few notches colder, about 10 degrees colder, and that can greatly change what they need to do to winter their hives. While I don't insulate mine, they insulate theirs, and they need another 40 pounds of honey on them to get through winter than I do. So let's look at the important variables. Dry colony, enough food, healthy bees. The first one, dry colony. Condensation kills. Wet bees are dead bees. That can be rain getting into the hive. It could be condensation from the bees' respiration condensing over their heads. And that's why I say the colony top must be more insulated than the sides. That can be with a solid inner cover or a foam inner cover. Now I had to sneak out to my bee resource pile to get an example of a foam board to show to you all. This is what goes between the outer cover and the inner cover on the hives I put a foam lid onto. And this just gives you a thermal break between the outside and the inside of that hive to reduce the risk of condensation overhead. These are pretty cheap. I just use they call it ½ inch, it's really 5/8 inch thick foam board because it's enough for me to be successful with. Some people use much thicker versions of that, and that is fine. And one of the key things, put a little duct tape over the inner cover opening, because if you don't, the bees will chew the holy heck out of this. What these do is they let the walls be colder than the roof. If the walls are colder than the roof, the condensation will occur on the walls. A few years back, I was called on a dead hive to investigate it, and what had happened, they had put a commercial insulative wrap around the sides of the hive, but the top was uninsulated. That meant the top was the coldest part of the hive, so the respiration condensed at that lid, and it rained down on the bees, destroying the colony. If the lid is insulated, if the coldest spot is the walls, the condensation occurs on the walls, and the condensation rolls down and away from the bees. That's fine, and the bees can even access that to hydrate themselves in wintertime. Quilt boxes are a popular item, also known as Vivaldi boards. These are supers filled with an insulating material that allow moisture to pass through, but they retain the heat in the hive. They are popular. I have never seen a study that looks at them individually for survival improvement. They are expensive and they are big, which is why you don't really see them in larger operations. There's also the Foam Fortress and colony wraps. I don't wrap colonies. Some people around here use tar paper. Mike Palmer uses tar paper. If you're in a colder area, you might benefit from doing the full insulative wrap, either commercially or homemade. This here is Teresa Martin, author of Dead Bees Don't Make Honey, and even though she lives in a region similar to mine, she fully insulates the hives with these foam barriers, much like a tan does. And she has great success with it. I think we don't really need that in our region because we regularly creep into cleansing flight temperatures. I think our bees can get away with not using this, but I think there is ample and growing evidence that in colder climates this can be a big benefit to use. And is the status quo in Omaha, which is just a little bit colder than I am. Another big thing here, don't use flat bottom migratory tops. The problem with a flat bottom migratory top is it can wick water from the outside to over the bees' heads. If that migratory lid has a rim on it or you have an inner cover underneath, that reduces that risk significantly. Just watch out for those flat bottom MIGs. And lastly, windbreaks or wind blocks. Again, you're not going to find a study on this, but the act of just putting some like political yard signs or hay bales around a colony can reduce the amount of direct wind impingement on that colony and keep that colony a little bit less weathered through the year. Second point, enough food. Starvation historically is the biggest killer in the unmanaged apiary. And we get into this a little bit deeper after this slide. First off, I want to talk. Mike Palmer has a thing about feeding sugar, and that the idea of putting solid feeds on top of the hive is fairly a new invention. And Mike believes the feed should be in the comb, and I am inclined to agree with him. I think liquid feed in the comb in a timely fashion is the best way to go. You must be prepared to feed every colony. You know, in an average year, a third to a quarter of my hives will need some feed to get them over wintering. That might be that colony was weak because I had a queen problem earlier in the year I didn't deal with, or maybe I stole bees out of it, or maybe I overharvested from them and they'll need a little help. Some years will have a major fall flow failure, and this is looking to be another one of those years, the third one in a row, where pretty much every colony needs feed, and that can greatly strain your equipment very rapidly, having to feed every colony, because that means you need feeders for every colony and a way to move the food around. So that's just one of those things to prepare for before you need it. And the last bullet point on this page is overfeeding hinders you. I feed to a target weight that I know is successful here. If I feed a colony over that, I'm increasing the odds they're going to have a bunch of spare food blocking up the brood nest when I'm trying to manage them in the spring, and that will be a hindrance. So feed to target weight. So target weights. Historically, the Kentucky recommendations were 50 pounds of honey. In my apiaries in Kentucky, and I'm in 6B, which has a low temperature of -5 Fahrenheit, I target double deep colonies weighing 90 pounds and single deeps weighing over 70. That said, I have these different weights on here. Like with a double, I say 90 pounds or higher is my target weight. The action weight is 70 pounds. So if I come across a hive that is 70 or less, I'm feeding them up to 90. If they're 75, if they're 80, I'm going to ignore them and let them ride because I usually can get away with that. I'll have enough time to know they're getting into trouble and put food onto them later on in the season. The starvation weight on one of these double deep colonies is around 55 pounds, so I can also figure out how close I am getting to them running out of steam. For singles in my area, I target a weight of 70 pounds. That is pretty packed in a single. A single maxes out around 90 pounds when it's all honey. So this is a pretty full single to get it to 70 pounds. And the action weight for single would be 55 pounds. Now that's also the same story for a double nuke, a nuke box with two boxes stacked on top of each other, 5 frame over 5 frame. Same weight requirements. And again, they're starving around 40 pounds, really 35 pounds. Now, some booming colonies, even when fed as described above, can run out of food by late winter. But usually in that same apiary, you're going to have some hives that haven't really touched the feed, and you can rob from those hives to support your booming colonies. You don't necessarily have to break out the feeders again, and that gets more comb empty for you so you can use it for brood rearing in the spring. Now in Omaha, which is just 10 degrees colder than I am, 5B, they need to have another 40 pounds on their hives. They need double deeps cruising 130 pounds. And that means their action weight is going to be somewhere around 110 pounds. And the reality is, you can't get enough honey into a single to meet their weight needs for wintering in Omaha. So that's why we have that crossed out here. Now, there's a couple different feed types, and they have their own hazards and methods. Let's start with the liquids. There's sucrose, table sugar. Uh, this is stuff you buy dry and mixed, generally speaking. You can buy it pre-mixed. It's relatively uncommon to encounter it. It is used in beverage manufacture. You can find it, but it's in very heavy totes when you do. Most people that use sucrose mixing buy dry sugar at the grocery store or Costco and mix it themselves. This is my mixing setup here. This is a 55-gallon barrel strapped into the back of my pickup truck with a trolling motor that I run off the truck's power supply. Trolling motors can beat the heck out of your sugar mix and can mix 1-to-1 using cold tap water. I usually use this setup for 2-to-1 using hot tap water to help the sugar dissolve. Now, there's pros and cons to sucrose. Sucrose is closer to nectar and is generally non-hazardous for the bees. You can mix it in whatever ratio you find beneficial for yourself. I'm usually mixing 2 to 1, and I'm also usually acidifying that with some apple cider vinegar to pull the pH down into the 5 range or 4.5 range. That's the range the these enzymes function better at, but you don't have to do that. 2 to 1 has some shelf life to it. 1 to 1 is a very short shelf life. The thinner syrups can spoil pretty rapidly. Now, you can keep that from happening by using something like Hive Alive supplement, which has a lot of thymol. Some people use thymol to keep that feed from fermenting. That is an option. Uh, it is non-viscous. You can pump it using electric pumps. We can't say that about high fructose corn syrup or Pro Sweet. These are much more viscous fluids and require heavier pumping equipment like a trash pump to move them. So with sucrose, I can mix it with a 12-volt trolling motor in my truck. Then I can pump it using a 12-volt farm pump that's rated at like 5.5 gallons into my actual feeders. It's pretty dang convenient. Now, high fructose corn syrup and Pro Sweet. High fructose corn syrup 55 is 55% solids fructose. That is what they use in the soda bottling industry. That is what you will get if you go to a Daydant distributor and buy high fructose corn syrup. It works. The bees, when they take fructose, tend to store it. They tend not to eat it. If you feed 10 pounds of sucrose, you're going to lose a couple pounds to the bees consuming it and making more bees. If you feed 10 pounds of high fructose corn syrup, they tend to store 10 pounds of high fructose corn syrup. So that can get you up to winter weight a little bit faster, but it's harder to source than sucrose is for the average beekeeper. ProSweet is the Man Lake proprietary feed. And the word on the street is it's really just a mix of high fructose corn syrup and sucrose. So you get the best and the worst of both worlds. It is shelf stable, but the bees don't build on it as well as they build on sucrose, and the bees don't store it quite as readily as they store high fructose corn syrup. So it kind of bridges the gap between those for better or for worse. And also with liquids, you need a feeder for them, which we'll talk about over here after we talk about these things. Now, solid feeds. Solid feeds are a more modern invention, really. There's a number of different solid feeds you can use. You can use sugar bricks. You can use mountain camp method, which is really just a bunch of dry sugar poured on top of a hive and allowed to set in place. You can use fondant. You can also use the bee-made fondants, the stuff like Hive Alive's purpose-made bee feeds. They work. I'm really not a fan of them compared to just getting them up to weight with liquids for a multitude of reasons we're not going to get into. But they are a viable option, especially if you have a hive you discover late in the game that needs feeding. Because these, you can only use these when you're above 55 degrees or so, and the bees can access it. Solid feed you can put on a hive below freezing, and the bees can use it if you put it right on top of their top bars. There is phagostimulants. These are the things that encourage bees to eat, hence the word phago and stimulant. That means eating stimulant. This can be honeybee healthy. It can be hive alive, things that make the food more attractive to the bees. I really don't think they're necessary. That said, the hive alive one has shown use in dealing with nosema infections. But for the most part, I find they can cause robbing risks, especially when feeding liquids. I remember years ago finding a hive being robbed out in the spring, which is a real rarity. And part of the reason why is I had a bunch of honeybee healthy in the feed that was attracting in robber bees. And the last bullet point on this side is moving syrup. If you feed any of these things, you have to transport them around in the apiary. With sucrose, I can pump it, and it's a lot cleaner than dragging buckets around and bucket brigading stuff like I've had to do with fructose in the past. So just be aware, you have to figure out how you're going to get that syrup to the hive without splashing it on the hive and causing a robbing event. Now, feeding for winter survival, you're much better off feeding in volume in the hive. If you feed with an open feeder, you're really just going to add weight to the strong colonies that don't need feed anyway, and you're not going to address the small colonies that need feed. You're much better off feeding the hive directly. And you need to feed in volume. You need to shove the food in so they store it instead of eating it. And this breaks down into three basic feeder types for in-hive feeding. They're buckets, top feeders, and division boards. Division boards are your frame feeders, and they do work. The real downside with them is you have to open up the hive to refill them, and like get into the hive to refill them. They have limited surface area, and they are a pain in the butt to clean if you have to clean them. The same can be said about buckets. They can be a pain in the butt to clean. But buckets are a cheap and effective way to do it. You can get your 2-gallon bucket, put over a hole on a migratory lid, and let the bees take down the food somewhat rapidly. I myself splurge on top feeders. This is actually one of my favorite designs. This is the Daydant one with these wooden rafts. It'll hold about 3 gallons of feed, but they have this tremendous amount of surface area relative to the feed, so the bees can take it down very rapidly. I've seen 3 gallons leave these things in 2 days, and that's hard to do with any other method. One thing I should note before I forget about it with high fructose corn syrup and in turn pro-sweet, it can decompose. Like when sucrose breaks down, it ferments, it gets moldy, it gets mildewy, and it's visible to the beekeeper, and you can get rid of it and the bees won't touch it. High fructose corn syrup is subject to thermal degradation at temperatures you can encounter in the United States. High fructose corn syrup that's been exposed to sunlight and heat starts to decompose into something called hydromethylfurfural, or HMF. HMF is highly toxic to the bees, and feeding that decomposed corn syrup will kill the bees, but you can't detect it by taste. It's one of those things you need a lab to figure that out. So that's one of the risks of high fructose corn syrup. Make sure you're buying it from a good source. Daydant usually can provide you test documents to show that theirs is new and in good service. Now, enough healthy bees. This is the biggest killer today. I said starvation used to be the biggest killer. Today it is enough healthy bees, and there's a reason for that. It's mites. Historically, the Kentucky recommendations was a basketball-sized cluster. Of course, we'd say basketball-sized in Kentucky. 5 to 12 pounds of bees, which is 5 to 12 frames of bees. I can tell you this standard is really looking at Italian stock. If you have Carniolan stock or a more conservative bee, you can get away with a lot less. You can drag nucleus-sized colonies through winter in my region. That said, wide open throttle colonies lose more bees over winter than insulated colonies. So a smaller colony is better off being insulated to help it survive. Just a thought if you only have so much equipment. Preparations to make sure you have enough healthy bees is queen replacement if indicated, combining those colonies that aren't big enough, and controlling pests. And the big thing with controlling pests is mites cause severe population loss before and during colony collapse. That honestly is the biggest winter killer, period, right there. Mites cause severe population loss. What happens is as the bees get beat up by the mite, they head out the door. They fly out, which means the colony population gets smaller and smaller and smaller until they can no longer thermoregulate and they freeze to death. So a good queen. We need a good queen in these colonies. Dodgy queens in summer spells a failed hive in winter. The queen will not get better as conditions get worse. We have Queen Elizabeth on here. She was a beekeeper. A lot of people forget. You want to requeen earlier is better than later. And I really say requeen before September 1st, and there's a reason for this. They're already rearing winter bees in your colonies. And if you replace the queen now, you're going to interrupt that winter bee production. So it's really better off requeening these colonies before we're out of August. And feed to drive young bee production. And we're talking 1-to-1 if needed. If you need to get their population boosted up, feed them 1-to-1. And get rid of your weak colonies. You can combine weak colonies that are otherwise healthy with strong colonies. That said, 2 weak colonies put together usually doesn't make a strong colony. Usually there's some sort of factor that's going to continue to cause them to dwindle. And beware, diseases like European foul brood are readily transmitted by combining. If you come across a weak EFB hive, you're most often going to be better off culling that colony before it collapses and gets robbed and infects the neighboring hives. Manage the apiary. Get rid of the bad colonies before they hit your apiary. Now, controlling pests and disease. This is the biggest factor in survival today, and that is Varroa control. And the reality is they must be controlled before winter. If you haven't managed your mite populations, you're going to have sick bees trying to rear your winter bee population, and that will not go well. Sick bees will transmit their disease to the winter bees. There are pests other than mites. There's mice, moths, and small hive beetles. Small hive beetle usually is not an issue in the wintertime. Moths destroy unprotected comb, so right size your colonies. Get them in the right amount of space for the population they have. And with mice, the big thing with mice is put on mouse guards before we're below 55 degrees. When it's above 55 degrees, bees will readily police the hive and chase a mouse out. Once we get into cluster temperatures, the mice can move in unconfronted. So get those mouse guards on your hives. I just use half-inch hardware cloth stapled over the entrance. There's also the other diseases we need to control for. I already mentioned EFB once. There's also varomorpha or nosema. Nosema is one of those things that I will lose a colony to every other year. The colony just kind of dwindles and fades away. And you really don't know what it is unless you send samples out for analysis or do the lab analysis yourself. That's just something to be aware of. And going further into mite population things, this is the biggest factor in survival is controlling your mites. Mite management for many begins in May with formic acid treatments. Late July, August, that's when supers come off. Here's when we apply our midsummer treatments. These are going to usually be your APA Guard or APA VAR because they're pretty dang effective, but require supers to be off the hive. You do want to make sure the treatment actually worked. There's a number of things that can cause treatments to fail, so do mite washes after treating to make sure efficacy. And understand there's some dynamics to mite populations. Mite reproductive cycles every 14 days. They can double their population every 14 days. And the bee population peaks around July, but the mite population grows for another month and get the populations to invert to where the percentage of mites suddenly spikes relative to the bees. This means mite wash counts can increase rapidly in late summer, and that may mean we need to watch for a lower treatment threshold before then. There is research coming out now about how the drones might be a mite well within the hive, and we're going to have to see if that pans out. Lastly, drift is real. If you have a colony sick with mites, it's going to spread to the colonies around it. This hive here was actually in an apiary we know was clean of mites a few months beforehand, and this is well over 100 mites in this colony. This was a colony known to be mite resistant. This is drift, this is robbing. You can get big spikes in mite numbers late in season, and you don't know unless you watch for it. Lastly, I really highly recommend winter oxalic applications. We'll get into treating mites on the next two slides. Now, late season mite control, sometimes you get surprised. You're going to have that happen. You're going to have that surprise 20 mites and 300 bees find in September. It's the nature of modern beekeeping. You just have to deal with it when it happens. We basically have three good proven methods and one on the way. Of the three good proven ones is amitraz. That can be Apivar, it can be Amiflex, it can be Magic Juice. The commercial beekeeping industry has relied on Tactic and Bovatraz for 20 years. They are flash treatments, as is Amiflex. They are not legal flash treatments, unlike Amiflex, but they are out there. And there's Apivar. Apivar is a slower acting plastic carrier. It's basically a strip made out of the same stuff as heat glue that's been loaded with amitraz and it discharges into the colony. Now, amitraz is great because you don't have a brood kill. It doesn't seem to negatively impact the queen with use. So you can use it somewhat willy-nilly. But there's concerns about efficacy, contamination, and treatment time. Amitraz rather, used to be really good at killing mites, and it's gotten worse and worse. And one day we're going to wake up and it's not going to be good enough anymore. It's going to lose that efficacy. So there's concerns about that and needing to continue to monitor and make sure it was effective. And then there's treatment time. Apivar is a 6-week treatment cycle. That said, I imagine it does most of its work in 4 weeks, but that is relatively long. Amiflex is a flash treatment, but it has to be repeated for it to be effective. So those are the pros and cons with that one. APA Guard, Thymol, really effective mite treatment, not much concern about the mites developing resistance, but it is a long-ish treatment cycle. It's weeks. And while it's on the hive, it induces broodlessness. This can be a real problem this time of year when they're raising the winter bees. If you cause them to be broodless for the next month, your winter population is going to be decidedly older and smaller, and that spells disaster. So Apiguard is an option, but it's increasingly non-viable as we get later into the year. And of course, formic acid. Formic acid is actually my go-to for these late surprise colonies because it is super rapid acting. I think most of the kill happens in 3 or 4 days when it's really belching off the formic acid vapors. But that causes a lot of chaos in the brood nest. The brood nest will go out of temperature. They're going to abort a lot of brood, and you're at risk of losing your queen. You can have 20% queen loss for formic acid. A colony that loses its queen now is dead. But I'm also, I accept that risk with these late mite count treatment hives because I know they're dead if I don't do something. And I'd rather risk losing 20% of my queens and having to combine down 20% of my colonies than losing all of those colonies that are having a high, like fatal high, late mite count. Lastly, we have oxalic, which is the half treatment option because no one's really figured out how to make it work yet in this part of the world. When there's brood, there's repeat treatment methods like gassing them every 5 days or the oxalic acid towels. They have been able to maintain mite counts with it, but they haven't been successful reducing mite counts here. And the issue is if you need to knock the mite numbers down, that's not an option for you. That said, University of Florida is working on high-dose methods that look promising, but until those are fully developed and, trialed, we really shouldn't be using them. It probably amounts to using a dose that's 3 times or so the current legal limit for the hive treatments to get that longer-term efficacy out of oxalic acid. I should note the Formic products are Formic Pro and Mite Away Quick Strips. Lastly is overwinter mite control, and really there's a silver bullet here, and that's oxalic acid. While oxalic acid doesn't work so great when there's brood in the hive, it is fantastic when a hive is broodless. It's almost totally effective. You're going to get a 99% plus mite kill using oxalic acid in a broodless hive. That means you can arrest mite damage and eliminate mite populations with few side effects for pennies a treatment, nickels a treatment. It's super cheap to use, super effective when timed well. And the perk with this is after using mite control in the winter with this oxalic acid, your colonies enter the spring with near zero mite count. So it takes a long time for them to get a dangerous mite count that needs control. So it really simplifies management. There are 2 methods to do the oxalic acid over winter. There's the dribble method, and there's the oxalic acid vaporization. I've got a long old video on oxalic acid vaporization. I would direct you there for details on that, where you convert the oxalic acid into a gas and inject it into the hive. The dribble method, you make a sugar oxalic acid mixture, and you dribble it on the bees, 5 mLs per seam of bees for 16 mLs max hive. And it works, but I run doubles, which means I'd have to bust boxes apart in the wintertime to treat the lower box, and that's just not viable for me, so I stick with the oxalic acid vaporization. I also have concerns about cracking open hives and doing the dribble, but I've seen people do it with snow on the ground without killing their colonies, so who knows? Now, an important question about survival. Do we need 100% survival? I'd argue we don't. My goal is to have greater than 90% survival because with that, I know I'm doing a pretty good job picking the colonies that can survive winter and going into winter with a good number of colonies. It also gives me wiggle room to experiment and see what works best for me. I really think aiming for 100% survival is a trap, and we end up keeping bees alive we necessarily shouldn't be. You can end up feeding colonies that have no business being in your area because they swarm too much. And we can end up overly supporting these colonies that aren't in our benefit to maintain. And that's why I say we really don't need 100% survival. My personal goal is 90 plus. I'm pretty dang happy hitting 90 plus, and I've done that for years at this point. The last bullet on here, necropsy. If you have a hive fail over winter, find out why. Take it apart, dissect it, see what was going on. And if you don't have the skills to do this, bring someone in who can. And if you have to, pay them for it. What this does is tells you what kills the colony, and that informs you what practices you have that are working and what aren't working. This is really where you improve for next year, is figuring out what didn't work this year. So I really recommend you do a dissection on these hives that fail, an autopsy or a necropsy. So let's see, let's put this all together. Manage the apiary. Cull, combine, treat, and feed for apiary success. Don't get hung up on making every colony survive winter or every colony able to survive winter. Some colonies aren't going to make it, and it is in your apiary's interest to deal with that now and not let Mother Nature take its course. And the big three ways we keep these colonies alive is maintaining a dry colony with enough food and plenty of healthy bees. I think with that, you'll be able to take your colonies into winter with high success and have a great spring. And with that, I'll say good luck and happy beaking.